He decided he wanted to design aircraft when he was 12 years old after reading Tom Swift and his airplane. He designed his first plane before he'd ever seen one in person. When he first applied for a job at Lockheed, the company turned him down flat. He got his master's degree in aeronautical engineering and returned and was rewarded for his persistence with an $83 a month job as a tool designer. By the time his career at Lockheed ended 47 years later, he had built the most important aircraft research and design facility in the world. There, in Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, he and the team he led revolutionized aviation. For 30 years, it was impossible to see a significant display of American aircraft without seeing something Kelly Johnson had designed. Whether it was a fighter, bomber, transport, passenger liner, or even a spy plane, the odds were that he had designed at least part of it. Without question, he is the greatest aircraft designer in history. He is Clarence Kelly Johnson, and he is a legend of Airpower. Clarence Kelly Johnson was born in the town of Ishpeming in Michigan's Upper Peninsula on February 27, 1910. The son of Swedish immigrants, he got his Irish nickname from schoolmates after he stood up to the school bully.
He had been dealing with some of the kids at the school calling him Clara, since his first name was Clarence. And he finally had his fill of it and decided to take reprisals on one of the bullies. And after he was finished, the kids in the schoolyard decided that he could no longer be a Clara, and instead they were going to find some more appropriate name. And since Irishmen were known at that time for their pugilistic skill, they decided to dub him Kelly.
He designed his first airplane, which he called the Merlin Battle Plane, as a 12-year-old, and it won him a prize at school. He knew then that was what he wanted to do with his life. He paid $5 for his first flight, a 3-minute trip in a biplane that ended badly when the plane's engine conked out at 700 feet. When he got older, he worked in construction and in the Buick factory and saved his money. He took his savings to a flight school and asked to be taught to fly. The flight instructor, a cash-strapped barnstormer, refused Johnson's money and told the young man to spend it on college. Johnson enrolled at the University of Michigan just before the stock market crash in 1929 and supported himself washing dishes in fraternity houses. As an assistant in the aeronautical engineering department, he worked with the school's wind tunnel. The school allowed him to rent the tunnel out when it wasn't in use. Johnson charged $35 an hour and helped design a new streamlined Studebaker model. He graduated in 1932 and tried to enlist in the Army Air Corps, but was refused. He returned to Michigan for his master's degree and, among other things, used the Michigan Wind Tunnel to help design aerodynamic racing cars for the Indianapolis 500. In 1933, he went to work for Lockheed in California as an $83 a month tool designer. Lockheed at the time was a deeply troubled company. It had just emerged from bankruptcy and had bet its future on the Electra, a 2-engine transport. When Johnson arrived in Burbank, his boss asked him what he thought of the plane. Johnson looked and said it would be unstable and that he did not trust Lockheed's wind tunnel tests. Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard sent Johnson back to Michigan with a model of the Electra and a mandate to do his own study in his own wind tunnel. "See if you can do better," Hibbard told him. He did. After 72 tunnel tests, Johnson came up with a newly designed flap system and traded the Electra's single stabilizer for a twin tail. Those changes stabilized the Electra and helped make it one of the most successful airplanes of its time. Johnson returned to Lockheed a full engineer. Assigned as the Model 10 Electra's flight test engineer, he at last started flying on a regular basis. He befriended Amelia Earhart and advised her on several of her missions. She flew an Electra, and Johnson advised her on techniques of fuel mixing to help her get the best performance out of her plane. He continued to work on updates to the Electra through Electra Model 14 and was soon attracting attention outside of Lockheed. In 1937, he won the Sperry Award for outstanding achievements in aeronautics by a young man. That same year, Congress passed the Neutrality Act. That law was designed to keep the United States out of World War II. At the same time, those in the military had become convinced that American involvement in the war was inevitable. They threw as many of their precious dollars as they could into the design of new equipment. Lockheed won the competition to build a new fighter with a plane designed by Johnson, the XP-38. With two engines and a double fuselage, it was an unconventional aircraft that had its share of problems. In particular, its high speed and tight maneuvering sometimes created forces so great that they shattered the plane in midair. Once again, Johnson went back to his wind tunnel, and after making a few changes to the plane's design, it passed Army Air Corps muster and was ordered into limited production. Johnson, the designer, was 27 years old. In the late 1930s, Lockheed came back from bankruptcy largely on the strength of its commercial aircraft. The Electra in particular had built a profitable customer base. But if Lockheed was going to grow, it was going to have to build a successful military aircraft business. The P-38 was a start, though when the Army Air Force first awarded the contract, no one knew how many thousands of planes would eventually be built. In 1938, with Europe on the brink of war, the British sent a purchasing commission to the United States in search of military aircraft, particularly a long-distance coastal patrol bomber that could be used to hunt submarines. The commission, scheduled to visit several aircraft manufacturers, did not originally intend to visit Lockheed. Their schedule changed at the last minute, and Lockheed was invited to make a presentation, with only 5 days to prepare. During the 5 days of preparation for the Brits, Johnson showed what he was destined to become famous for: the ability to make something entirely new out of existing components, and to manage a project to completion with a ruthless eye to the deadline.
He himself lived by the credo, be quick, be quiet, be on time. He was somebody who believed very much in getting good people and giving them the ability to do what they do best. He also believed in minimizing the number of people working on any one project.
In only 5 days, Johnson and his crew not only redesigned the Electra to fit the needs of the Royal Air Force, they also built from scratch a full-scale wooden model of the plane, a civilian transport converted into a medium bomber. The Brits were amazed. They were so impressed by Johnson and his crew, they invited Lockheed executives to England to confer with the Air Ministry. Johnson went along. At the meetings, the British changed the design specifications, necessitating a complete redesign of the aircraft. Johnson locked himself in a London hotel room and in only 72 hours completed the engineering drawings. The British were, once again, amazed, and Lockheed got the contract. But not before the British expressed their hesitancy about working with an engineer as young and inexperienced as the 28-year-old Johnson. Lockheed reassured the Air Minister, who ordered 200 of what became known as the Hudson Bomber. It was the largest single order of aircraft ever received by an American manufacturer. And upon the party's return to the United States, Lockheed promoted Johnson to chief engineer. In 1939, the Congress significantly increased the defense budget, and P-38 started rolling off the line in record numbers. During this period, Johnson truly mastered the art of manufacturing, streamlining production processes, and developing an entirely new job, the program manager. Now a staple of manufacturing, the program manager is a person far down the chain of command who has working control of a project. If that all seems a bit heavy on the business administration in a discussion of aircraft, consider this. Johnson believed that outstanding aircraft designed and manufactured quickly were inevitably the product of a single visionary. That visionary was usually, of course, Johnson.
He was not someone who believed in development via committee. He was also somebody who hated lengthy reports and normally limited any report that was sent to him to 20 pages. He believed in brevity, he believed in clarity, and he believed in giving people the tools necessary to get the job done.
In 1943, Lockheed put Johnson in charge of advanced products research, setting him up on a plot of land on the outskirts of Burbank, California. Johnson called his new kingdom the Skunk Works, after the still in a cartoon strip, Little Abner, that was responsible for the making of a mysterious and powerful brew called Skunk Works.
In the Little Abner cartoon, there was a potent mystery elixir known as Kickapoo Joy Juice. And Kickapoo Joy Juice was made at the Skunk Works, or Skunk Works, as it was called in the comic strip, through a variety of things that were thrown into a giant mixture, among them skunks, old shoes, and things like that. And the nickname was applied to the Lockheed operation because indeed it was a mystery elixir. Nobody was quite sure what was going on in there, but they knew that a lot of things were being thrown into it and that Kelly Johnson was pulling a lot of people from various locations in order to create something interesting.
The job of the Skunk Works was to quickly, cheaply, and secretly develop advanced aircraft that could help win the war. Its first assignment was the P-80 Shooting Star, the first American jet. Intelligence had determined the Germans were far along in their development of jets, and the not-so-secret fear of the Army Air Force was that the Nazis would deploy their jets in large numbers before the war in Europe had ended. The effect on the Allied bombing campaign would have been horrendous. The Allies' propeller-driven fighters would have been almost useless against a jet-powered fighter.
Kelly Johnson, in his efforts to oversee those operations, would pull people from other projects and would go about trying to get a minimum number of the very best people and put them on the project, give them minimal supervision, but let them trust them to be able to do the jobs that they're chosen to do.
After setting up the Skunk Works and recruiting his team, Johnson went to work on the P-80. Lockheed's contract with the Army Air Force gave him an incredibly short schedule, 180 days. Johnson went on a binge of designing and set his team to work on various critical paths and had the prototype ready for testing 37 days ahead of schedule. In 5 months, Lockheed had designed and built the first American jet. They hauled it from Burbank to Muroc Air Base in the California desert for testing. Fearful that there might be spies in the surrounding hills, they disguised the jet during transport with a plywood propeller. Johnson said years later that when he rolled out a new plane for testing, there was only one thing he thought about. What have I forgotten? In the case of the P-80, despite the short design and construction cycle, he hadn't forgotten much. It was a beautiful aircraft, faster and more agile than anything in the American arsenal. The war ended before it saw combat, but it evolved into the T-33, one of the best and longest-lived jet trainers in history. When the war ended, however, there were those who questioned whether the Skunk Works had a role to fill. After World War I, the business of aviation had shrunk almost to non-existent. After World War II, many people expected that it would again. But there were two basic differences between the ends of the wars. First, the United States was engaged in the world after World War II in a way it wasn't after World War I. No one could reasonably expect the world's only nuclear power to go back into hibernation. And second, before the war ended, it became clear that the post-war world would require a strong and ready military. Because on the day the Japanese surrendered, the world separated into two groups of allies, those in the communist East under the control of Joseph Stalin, and those in the democratic West. World War II was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works were just about to become the most important aircraft developers in the world. Over the course of his career, Kelly Johnson designed more than 40 aircraft. His most prolific period by far was in the 1950s. That was a decade of tremendous technological advance, achieved in an atmosphere of never-ending crisis. And there was no better place for aeronautical engineers to work than the Skunk Works. Johnson designed and built the Constellation, the most elegant aircraft of its time, and a plane that served effectively in both civilian and military roles. He experimented unsuccessfully with vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, with the idea that they could operate from relatively small ships. He designed the F-104 Starfighter, at 1,300 miles an hour, the fastest aircraft ever flown at the time. It was a sometimes fussy plane to fly, and at more than Mach 2, there wasn't a lot of room for error. It was adapted around the world to a number of difficult tasks, including carrying nuclear weapons. Johnson didn't approve of all the modifications others were making to his plane, but could do little about them. As the Cold War heated up, it became clear that the United States needed a way to peer deep into Russian territory. East of the Ural Mountains, where the Russians did their atomic research and where they developed their aircraft and missiles, the United States didn't even have an accurate topographical map, let alone a way of getting information on military capabilities. The Air Force put out a quiet request for a fast, high-altitude plane that could overfly Russia and bring back pictures of the communist secret bases. Johnson at first toyed with modifying the F-104, but it lacked the range and would be too difficult to fly on long missions. In 1954, he sent the Air Force a proposal to build a plane that could fly at a range of 4,000 miles above 70,000 feet. It would be slower than the Air Force had hoped, but at that altitude would be high above Russian air defenses. The Air Force didn't believe Johnson could do it. They doubted any jet engine would work at that altitude, and instead ordered a competition between manufacturers for the best biplane design. President Eisenhower approved a $35 million contract with the competition winner. Johnson and his Skunk Works team went into overdrive. In mid-November 1954, he met with a government advisory board on what was then called the CL-282 project. 10 days later, he formed the team to design the craft. On December 2nd, the first 12 engineers went to work designing the aircraft systems, and the first design drawings were completed and released to the shop for manufacture the next day. A week later, the drawings were complete, and by the end of the year, he'd won the contract and frozen the design. Wind tunnel testing completed in March, the first plane finished in July, and the first flight took place on August 4th, 1955. In less than a year, from pipe dream to first flight, Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works had designed and built a completely new kind of airplane. The U-2 had something of a patched-together quality, to be sure. The first ones cut weight by leaving out the ejection seat, and the balancing wheels on the wings dropped off at takeoff to lose a few more pounds. The engineers were still making modifications on the craft in the summer of 1956, when a young pilot named Francis Gary Powers saw his first U-2 parked on a taxiway at a secret base in Nevada. It had not been built to last, he said years later. Powers was among the pilots who flew spy missions over the Russian heartland in the U-2, and for years it was safely out of range of the Soviets. The planes routinely returned with photographs showing Russian fighters 4 miles below them, coming up for a fight but unable to fly high enough to get a shot off. Eventually, however, the Russians improved their air defenses, and by the time Powers was shot down in 1960, Johnson was already at work on his next-generation spy plane. Johnson, with the U-2s flying with seeming impunity, had gone back to the government to propose a plane that could fly 10,000 feet higher and 4 times as fast as the subsonic U-2. Building a plane that would cruise at Mach 3.2, Johnson said years later, was the hardest thing the Skunk Works ever did. Everything about the plane, Johnson said, had to be invented. In 1960, the Air Force gave the go-ahead for Johnson to develop the A-12, a plane that didn't succeed as an interceptor, but paved the way for its slightly larger sister, the SR-71 Blackbird. Built out of titanium, which is light and could tolerate the 500-degree temperatures that built up as the plane sliced through the atmosphere at more than 3 times the speed of sound, the Blackbirds were like something out of a science fiction movie. The rollout was Johnson's proudest day. It was, he said, the smoothest test flight he'd ever been through. Johnson, who had never been much of a talker, insisted that he was not bothered by the fact that he couldn't talk about his perfect airplane. If I can talk about it, he'd like to say, it's obsolete. But years later, when word of the SR-71 had leaked out and the Air Force had stopped denying its existence, he took joy in its racing from New York to London, a distance of almost 3,500 miles in less than 2 hours. And before the Blackbirds were retired in March 1990, an SR-71 flew across the United States coast to coast in 68 minutes. Kelly Johnson retired from Lockheed in 1975. Even then, he was a presence at the Skunk Works. His 14 rules of effective program management are gospel there and are taught in some of the leading business schools in the world. Johnson even consulted with Lockheed during the development of the F-117 stealth fighter. As an old man, he said that there would come a time when aircraft were no longer relevant. People wouldn't travel for business, he said, because they could sit at their desks and talk to people in Europe by video phone. And on the battlefield, manned aircraft were no longer cost-effective in an age of missiles. Though it hasn't happened yet, don't bet against it.
I think his greatest contribution was in the vision that he had for the Skunk Works, for Lockheed, for American aviation, and in his ability to translate that vision into something that other people embraced and believed in and wanted to work toward. To a great extent, his greatest contribution was his ability to get other people to commit to his dream.
Kelly Johnson died just before Christmas in 1990.